Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. The Easter That Changed My Life, submitted by Diane X from New Hampshire. I love your channel and really loved your scary farm stories, and it inspired me to write to you of my scary story that also happened on a farm and also around this time of year many years ago. I'm 48 years old now, and I've lived a pretty full life. I've raised kids, I've buried loved ones, and I've built a career I never would have imagined as a child. I faced fear more than once since this happened. But what happened was a time in my life when I knew without a doubt that I was going to die. It happened on Easter Sunday in 1986 on my family's farm. I was 10 years old. Back then, Easter wasn't just a holiday for my family, it was an event. Our farm sat on a wide stretch of land with rolling fields, a big old red barn that leaned slightly to one side, and a creek that cut along the far edge of the property. In springtime, everything came alive again. There was mud, there was grass, there was bugs, and there was the cold, rushing water in that creek, fed by melting snow and heavy rains. That year, I remember the rain was relentless. For days leading up to Easter, it just poured. The fields were soft and spongy, and the creek, normally something we could hop across in places, had swollen into something faster, louder, and deeper. Kids, unfortunately, don't think about danger the way adults do. All that us kids knew was, Easter meant an Easter egg hunt. My cousins were there, along with my brothers and sisters. There had to have been 10 or 12 of us, running around, buzzing with energy and clutching cheap plastic baskets and arguing about who would find the most eggs. The adults gathered near the house, laughing, drinking coffee, and just watching us like we were putting on a show. I remember my mom calling out, "Stay where we can see you," and we all did what kids did. We nodded and said, yeah, but none of us listened. The eggs were scattered across the yard and into the fields, those bright plastic ones. Some were tucked by fence posts, some were hidden near tree stumps. And at first, it was just chaos, all of us bumping into each other, shouting and laughing, and grabbing whatever we could find. I was terribly competitive at that age, and I noticed something that the others didn't. The farther edges of the property, near the old fence line and beyond, looked like no one had been over there yet. And I remember thinking, that's where the good stuff is. So I slipped away from the group that was still in chaos. And at first I could still hear everyone laughing and shouting and calling out how many eggs that they had. The farther away I went, the quieter it got. The ground became wetter and softer, and my shoes were sinking slightly with each step, making that squishy sound that I can still hear if I think about it. I didn't care that my feet were getting wet. I kept going because I knew there would be a treasure trove of eggs back there. The fence line came into view, with the old wooden posts leaning at all the goofy angles they laid at. And beyond it, the land dipped slightly toward the creek. And that's when I saw it. Bright and half hidden. Something round and pale sitting near the edge of the embankment. It was an egg. I was sure of it. It looked a little different from the other plastic eggs I'd been picking up, a little bigger maybe. But I remember feeling thrilled that it was the special egg. Maybe it had something better inside than all the other ones. I hurried over to it, clutching my basket, and the ground there looked solid enough. There was grass in patches, and the dirt beneath it didn't seem any different from the rest of the fields. So I stepped closer, and then the ground gave way. I don't have any clean memory of falling, just a sudden, sick feeling of nothing beneath my feet, and the sound of earth breaking apart. Seconds later, I hit the water, and it was like being slammed into ice. The cold water stole the air from my lungs instantly, turning my gasp into a choking swallow of muddy water, and of course, the current just grabbed me and took me. I didn't even have time to understand what was happening before I was being pulled downstream. I do remember flailing and trying to find something, anything to grab onto, but I just helplessly watched as the bank was rushing past me. I remember the water being so loud, roaring in my ears. And I tried to scream, but all that came out was this weak little broken sound. And then I went under the water, and everything turned brown and silent. I kicked and fought my way back to the surface with a desperate gasp and realized I couldn't feel my hands or my feet. My clothes seemed to be pulling me down. They were heavy and soaked with water. And I do remember thinking at 10 years old, this is it. I mean, not in those words exactly, but you get the idea. I was going to die in a creek I'd walked through 100 times. I did my best to keep my head above water, but every second felt harder than the last. The cold was taking over my body and slowing me down, making my limbs feel like they didn't belong to me anymore. The current was slamming me sideways, then throwing me forward, and then a huge impact. I crashed into something hard. Rocks. Really big rocks. The force knocked what little breath I had out of me, but somehow it also stopped me from moving down the creek. I had wedged myself between them, and the water was just rushing around and over me. And I grabbed onto the rocks with everything that I had. But I found that I couldn't move. I couldn't climb out. I was just stuck. The water was blasting by me, sometimes rising high enough to cover my mouth and forcing me to tilt my head back just to breathe. And I remember trying to scream, "Help! Help!" But to me, it just sounded small and weak and useless. I didn't know how long I was there. I just remember the cold not being so cold anymore. It just felt deep and heavy, if that makes any sense. Which it does if you know anything about hypothermia. My body started to shake uncontrollably, and then that even slowed down. I remember my grip loosening at one point, and then I thought to myself, maybe I should just let go. And that was the scariest part to think about. It wasn't the water, it wasn't the cold. It was a 10-year-old just saying, you know what, give up. But then I started thinking about my mom and my family, and I pictured them all back at the house laughing and counting their eggs, and not knowing that I was gone. Something in me came back, and I snapped and I tightened my grip again, digging my fingers into the rock like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. Because honestly, it was. Eventually, after what I learned was nearly an hour later, I heard something different. I heard voices. They were faint and distant, but they were voices. I tried screaming out again, but barely anything came out of my mouth. But someone heard it, and then I saw movement on the bank. There were a whole bunch of figures running. My dad, my aunts, my mom, my uncles, my cousins. And I'll never forget the look on my dad's face when he saw me. It was a look of pure terror. My dad and two uncles scrambled down the embankment, slipping in the mud and shouting to each other and to me, "Hold on! Hold on!" My dad waded in first, bracing himself against the current, and my uncle followed him, grabbing onto him as they made their way towards me. They didn't stop. They reached me, and my dad grabbed me under the arms and tried to pull me free from between the rocks, and I remember it hurting like hell. But suddenly, I was out. My dad pulled me up against him, holding me as tight as he could, and I remember him struggling to get back to shore. I don't remember much after that, just splashes, being laid on the ground and someone wrapping me in blankets. I remember my mom sitting over me crying, but all the voices seemed to be overlapping one another. And I do remember sirens. And after that, I woke up in the hospital. I was warm and dry and alive. The doctor told my parents that I was lucky, that the water temperature alone should have killed me, and that if I had been in there for another 10 or 15 minutes, well, I don't like to think about that part. I developed pneumonia not long after that, and my lungs had taken too much water in. My body had been pushed too far. It took me weeks to recover, but I did. Physically. Mentally, I was a wreck. But that day changed everything. It was the only time in my life I truly believed I was going to die. Not in a distant, abstract way, but right there, in that moment, with the cold water pressing around me, over me, and me having no way out. It gave me something I'd never had before. Perspective. and respect for how quickly things can go wrong, and a need to make sure other kids didn't end up where I did. I've spent most of my adult life teaching first aid, swimming lessons, teaching kids and parents how to recognize danger before it becomes tragedy. Because honestly, sometimes it's not the obvious things that get you. Sometimes it's those bright little eggs sitting just out of reach that are always one step too far away. I hope you get this in time for Easter. Happy Easter, everybody. Creepy Easter, submitted by Devin K. I'm 28 now, and I still don't like Easter. People think it's because I grew out of it. The candy, the eggs, the whole Easter bunny thing. That's not it. Honestly, I'd give anything to go back to believing in something harmless like that. When I was 7 years old, I still believed the Easter bunny was real. And one night, I thought I heard him. It was the night before Easter Sunday, what my mom always called Easter Eve. Back then, to me, it felt just as magical as Christmas Eve. My older brother Kyle was 9 and already starting to act too cool for it, but I wasn't there yet. I had my little basket set out on the kitchen table, fake grass all fluffed up, and hoping to wake up to chocolate eggs and Peeps. It was just the 3 of us, my mom, Kyle, and me. My dad died when I was 3, so he'd been gone for years. Mom worked a lot, but she tried hard to make holidays feel special. And that night, she tucked us in like usual, and I remember her pausing in the doorway smiling. "Don't come downstairs tonight. You don't want to scare the Easter bunny away." For me, I took that seriously. I must have fallen asleep pretty fast because the next thing I remembered was waking up in the middle of the night, not having any idea what time it was. The house was quiet except for a faint noise downstairs. At first, I thought it was just part of a dream, but then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps walking around downstairs. My eyes snapped open, and I remember just lying there, staring at the ceiling and listening. The steps weren't loud. They were careful, like whoever was down there didn't want to be heard. And my heart started racing, but not out of fear, out of excitement. The Easter bunny. That's what I thought. I swear to God, that's what I thought. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could. The floor was cold under my feet. Kyle was asleep across the room, snoring lightly, completely unaware. And I remember hesitating at the door, my mom's voice echoing in my head, "Don't go downstairs." But I wanted to see him. Just a peek, just proof he was real. I opened the door slowly, and the hallway was dark, but there was a faint glow coming up from downstairs. There was a light on in the living room. We always left one lamp on at night. So I stepped out of my room and started toward the stairs. And the closer I got, the clearer the sounds became. It wasn't just footsteps now, there was movement, something brushing against the furniture. And then there was complete silence. I froze at the top of the stairs, and for a second I almost turned back, but then I thought, what if he leaves and I never get to see him? So I started down. I was desperately trying to stay quiet like I was sneaking up on something magical. And when I reached the bottom, I turned toward the living room. And that's when everything stopped being magical. The window was open, and the curtain was moving slightly, pushed by a breeze drifting into the house. Standing in the middle of the living room was not the Easter bunny. It was a man. He was tall, taller than anyone I'd ever seen before. His back was partially turned toward, like he'd just been looking around. And while I could tell it wasn't the real Easter bunny, he was wearing an Easter bunny costume. Not the kind we saw the guy wearing at the mall, and not the kind you see in stores. It wasn't bright, it wasn't cartoonish. This one was dirty. It was off-white, almost gray, and the fur looked matted in places. The head was oversized, of course, with long ears that drooped slightly. But the face, oh my God, the face when he turned around, had these hollow-looking eye holes, dark and empty and scary. He looked right at me, and for a second my brain tried to make it make sense. I mean, it's the Easter Bunny, right? But nothing about him felt right. Not the way he was standing, not the way his chest rose and fell too fast, and not the way his head was tilted at me like he was trying to understand what he was seeing in front of him. We just stared at each other. I don't know for how long. It felt like forever. That's when I noticed his hands. He didn't have any gloves on. They were bare. And they were holding on to something. A black bag. And something inside it clinked softly as he shifted. My stomach dropped, and something in me, some instinct I didn't even know I had, kicked in. I knew this was not the Easter Bunny. This was something else. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out at first. It was like everything in my body was frozen. And then the man moved, but not towards me. He moved away. He turned suddenly, almost slipping on our living room rug, and he bolted toward the open window. He moved really fast for someone in a costume like that, and the bag swung around wildly as he ran. He never looked back at me. He just climbed out the window in one motion and disappeared into the darkness outside. And that's finally when my voice came back, and I screamed my head off. I saw lights flipping on upstairs, and I heard my mom shouting my name, and footsteps were pounding down the stairs as she rushed into the living room and grabbed me, pulling me close. "Sweetheart, Devin, what's wrong? What happened?" And I was crying too hard to form any words. I just kept pointing at the window. He was there. There was a bunny. She looked at the open window, and her face changed instantly. It wasn't confusion. It was fear. She rushed over and slammed the window shut, locked it, and then grabbed the phone. I just sat there clinging to her leg as she called the police, her voice tight and controlled as she explained that someone had been in our house. A minute later, Kyle came down, wide-eyed and confused. The police arrived fast. There were flashing lights filling the street outside, and officers came in the front door and asked questions and searched the house. I sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket, trying to explain to them what I saw, but I just kept saying, "A bunny. He was wearing a bunny suit." Nobody laughed, especially not after what they found. The bag. He must have dropped it in his rush to get out. It was near the couch, partially tucked underneath like he had set it down while moving around. But that's not what happened, he just dropped it. One of the officers opened it, and even at 7, I could tell something was wrong by the way his expression changed. They didn't show me everything, but I heard enough. Duct tape, bottles, one of them later identified as amyl nitrate, sex toys, and other things I didn't understand at the time, but I do now. My mom pulled me closer, pressing my face into her side so I wouldn't see, and suddenly my house didn't feel like my home anymore. It felt violated and scary. The police dusted the window for prints, and they found them easily on the sill where this guy had climbed in. Before they left, one of the officers crouched in front of me and said, "You did a good job, son. You scared him off." But I didn't feel brave. I felt sick, and I felt sad. For days after, I couldn't sleep. I mean, every single noise made me jump, and every shadow seemed to be alive. The police came back a few days later. They'd caught the guy. I remember my mom sitting me and Kyle down at the kitchen table, and her face was pale, but she was trying to stay calm. She said to us, "The guy's not coming back. They found him." And I asked who he was. Mom hesitated, but then she told us. It was a man she had met on a dating site a few weeks earlier. They had gone out once, just once. He made me uncomfortable, she explained, so I told him that we weren't really a good match, and that was it. There was no big fight, no dramatic ending. It was just a rejection. But apparently, that wasn't enough for him. The police said he had become fixated on my mom, that he tried to find out where we lived, and somehow, well, he did. He came back for what he wanted. Those words didn't make any sense to me at 7, but they do now. And the part that never made any sense, then or now, was why the hell was he wearing a costume? The police never explained that. I mean, my mom asked. I know she did. I heard her once late at night on the phone, her voice shaking. Why the bunny suit? But there was never an answer. Maybe he thought it would scare us kids less, or maybe it was just some weird, twisted fantasy, or maybe it was just another layer of something deeply broken in him. We stayed in that house for another year, but it was never the same. Every night, my mom double-checked every lock and every window. She actually installed a burglar alarm, and she stopped letting us out of her sight for so long. And she stopped going on the internet looking for dates. A couple of years later, she met someone through church, a really good guy. The kind of person who makes you feel safe just by being around. They got married and life moved on, but that Easter Eve has always stayed with me. I Wish I Could Say She's Gone, submitted by Jim. Jim's not my real name. Neither is my son named Ryan. He's a fan of yours and told me I should share our story, and that you'd read it. So here goes. But before I go on, shout out to my little big wingman, Ryan. We've been through a lot, and maybe writing this out will give me some kind of closure. I can only hope. This happened quite some time ago. Ryan's 18 now, and the older he gets, the more I see it in his eyes. The same question that's been hanging between us since one fateful Easter so long ago. Whether or not she's really gone. She being Ryan's mom. It didn't start scary, and that's the thing. It started like something clean, like closure at the time. My wife Jessica walked out on us when I was 30 and Ryan was 5. No screaming, drawn-out fights, and just one night she sat down at the kitchen table, hands folded like she was about to say grace, and told me she didn't want the life she was in anymore. She didn't want me, and she didn't want him, meaning Ryan. It took a little while, but I finally tracked her down with divorce papers. I remember standing in the doorway of some upscale apartment she clearly couldn't afford on her own, and I could see a guy in the background, an older guy, with money written all over him. When she took the papers from me, she didn't even look ashamed. She just said, "I don't want anything. No custody, no support, nothing." Ryan was holding my hand at the time. He didn't cry, he just squeezed my hand tighter. And that was the last we saw of her. For 5 years. By the time she came back, Ryan barely remembered her voice, and I wish I could say I didn't recognize the knock on the door the night that it happened, but I did. There was just something about it. I opened the door, and there was Jessica standing on the porch like she'd never left. Same eyes, same little smile, but something was off, like something inside her had been rearranged. She just looked at me and said, "Jim, we need to talk." Ryan came into the hallway behind me, taller now, and a lot smarter, too. 10 years old and already carrying more weight than he should have been. I remember her looking at him and saying, "There's my baby." And I remember Ryan stepping back, saying, "I'm not your baby." And honestly, that should have been the end of it. I told her to leave. She waited. Ryan told her to leave. But she just stood there for a long time looking at us like she was memorizing something. But then she had that weird little smile again and said, "Okay, I'll go." And she did. And again, that should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. 2 days later, we left Dallas. The plan was a simple one. We were going to take a road trip up to Portland, Oregon, and see some sights and clear our heads on the way, and then spend Easter with my parents. Ryan had been looking forward to it for weeks, constantly looking at maps online and even maps that he got from the library that he spread across our dining room table, with little post-it notes around places that he wanted to stop. Everything started off extremely normal, and then we hit Amarillo. We stopped at a place that everybody talked about, Cadillac Ranch. You know, those rows of old cars buried nose first in the ground, covered in layers of spray paint? Yeah, Ryan wanted to see it, so we stopped. I remember the sky turning gray and the wind was cutting across the field like it had teeth, and there weren't many people out there. Ryan ran ahead of me laughing and picked up a spray paint can someone had left behind and said, "Can I?" I just laughed and said, "Go for it, man." I watched him spray his name onto a rusted side of one of the cars, bright blue against decades of other colors. And that's when I also saw her, standing on the far side of the row. Jessica. She didn't move towards us, she just stood there with her hair whipping crazily in the wind. And for a second, I thought I was imagining her. And then she lifted her hand and waved at us, slowly and deliberately. I looked at Ryan, and he hadn't seen her yet. But he could tell something was off and said, "Dad, you okay?" I reached down and grabbed his arm and said, "All right, kid, we gotta go." And he said, "What? Why?" And I said, "Son, now." He looked at my face again and didn't argue. We walked fast, back toward the car, and I didn't look back until we were about halfway there. Where she'd been standing, she was gone. We got in and I locked the doors. Ryan said, "Are you okay, Dad?" And I said, "Yeah, buddy, everything's okay." The next few days were much of the same. Gas stations, restaurants, and bad motels. I told myself that the thing that happened at Cadillac Ranch was a coincidence, that maybe she'd followed us that far and just got lucky that we would stop there. But something deep down inside me knew that she was following us for some reason, and I was right. The next time we saw her was in Colorado. We stopped near some mountains, this really great scenic overlook. We could see nothing but miles of trees and rocks and mountains. And honestly, I was hoping for it to be peaceful. I purchased Ryan his first DSLR camera, nothing fancy. He was really into taking pictures, and he thought this was a great opportunity, and so did I. The sun was starting to dip, and everything was just that golden color. As he gazed along looking for things to take pictures of, he froze and said, "Dad." I followed his gaze to where he was looking, and there was a car parked a little ways down from ours. The driver's side door was open, and Jessica was standing beside it. She wasn't even looking at us. She was looking over the edge, kind of like where we were looking. Then I noticed her get up on top of the little ledge that was there, and I told Ryan, "Stay put, buddy." I walked over towards her, my heart hammering. I got within 4 or 5 feet of her and said, "Jessica, this shit isn't funny." She looked down at me like she had just noticed me for the first time, and she said the creepiest thing. "I miss this, the 3 of us traveling." I looked at her and said, "Jessica, this isn't traveling. This is you following us. This is stalking." Then she said something else that I never understood. "You brought me here." "I didn't bring you here. You followed us." "You always bring me here," she said again. Then she stepped closer to the edge. For a second, I thought, Jesus Christ, is she going to jump? I said out loud, "Stop." She laughed, and it was a weird bark of a laugh. "Oh, you still care," she said. Then she hopped down from the ledge and walked over to her car, got in, started it up, and drove it away. I called the police. I told them what was happening, but by the time they got there, there was no sign of her and nothing that they could do. I hadn't thought of checking out the license plate on her car. There was no record of her ever even being there. It was like she was slipping through the cracks and no one else could see. And it got worse after that. Little things. One night our motel room door wouldn't stay locked, and I heard footsteps outside at night that stopped the second I opened the curtain of the windows. Another time there was a note slipped under my car's windshield wiper that just said, "You can't keep him from me." Ryan knew something was wrong and wouldn't sleep. I started keeping my little pocket knife under my pillow. Eventually, we cut the trip short. We skipped stops and drove longer hours. At that point, we just wanted to get to Portland and my parents. Anywhere away from her. But she kept showing up, always disappearing before anyone else would notice she was there. The last time before Portland was the worst. We'd stopped at his small roadside diner just before we entered Oregon, and the rain was coming down hard. Ryan and I were sitting in a booth by the window, and halfway through the meal, he was staring outside. "Dad, she's here," he said. And I turned quickly and saw her standing there in the rain, just staring at us through the glass. She was soaked. Her clothes were clinging to her like she'd been standing there for hours. I stood up so fast I bumped my legs on the table. I rushed to the door, but by the time I got there, she was gone. But this time she left something behind. There was a handprint on the glass and smeared in something darker than water. Obviously, we were both very unnerved, and we finally made it to Portland. I'd never been so relieved to see my parents' house in my life, and Ryan ran inside first, and my mom hugged him so tight I thought he'd disappear into her. I'd called them a couple of times from the road and let them know what was going on, and she went into overprotective mode. So for a few hours, everything felt normal again. The subject of Jessica obviously came up, and I didn't bring up the fact that when I did speak with her that she seemed unstable. My dad locked the doors anyway, something he never did. The kind of guy that always left the front door unlocked, just in case a friend showed up and needed to get in. That first night, I barely slept. Every little sound set me off. But then around 2 a.m., I heard something to set me off. Glass breaking. I was out of bed in seconds, and I heard Ryan scream, "Dad!" I ran down the hallway and grabbed a golf club out of my dad's set that he had left by the back door for some reason. The back window was shattered, and cold air was just blasting in. Jessica was halfway through it. Blood on her arms where the glass had cut her, and she was smiling at me. "I'm home," she said. Something in me snapped. I charged her, and she kind of stumbled back out the window, hitting the ground hard. And I followed through the door, adrenaline drowning out everything else, and screaming, "Get the hell out of here!" She tried to scramble to her feet, and I could see blood running down her face and all across her chest and arms. "You can't keep him," she said. "I'll never forget that. He's mine," she said. I took a step towards her and swung the golf club, not to really hit her, just to drive her back and scare her. She tripped and fell hard against the concrete edge of my parents' patio. And that sound her head made when it hit was not a good sound. She went still, and for a second I thought, "Oh shit, I killed her." That's when I noticed Ryan was right behind me, crying, and my parents were on the phone calling the police. I dropped the golf club and backed away. I was physically shaking. But then I saw her chest rise and fall. She wasn't dead, thank God. We heard the sirens coming quickly, and paramedics rushed in the front door, out the back door, and lifted her onto a stretcher. There was blood everywhere. Her face was pale and her eyes were half open, and I know she looked at me as they were loading her into the ambulance. I know she looked at me because she had that weird smile again. The police later told us, after they had spoken with the doctors and the hospital folks, Jessica had severe mental issues. Well, I didn't need to be told that, but I didn't know how severe. They said not only had she been unstable for years for not being on medications, that she was also dangerous. They said we did the right thing. But that didn't make anything feel any better. Jessica survived, and she never came back. Not after that episode. Still, Ryan and I didn't take any chances. A year later, my company moved me to New Orleans, a great neighborhood, but I put extra locks on everything, got a camera system set up. Security can't be tight enough around here. Ryan, he grew up, and I tried to forget everything. But every Easter, the memories come back, not only for me, but for him too. That road trip, the places where she appeared, and the way she always seemed to find us. Tonight, Ryan and I were sitting on the porch, warm air in our quiet street. It's the kind of neighborhood that I've always wanted to live in. It's a great, safe place. Ryan is taller than me now. In the fall, he's going off to play D1 football as a tight end. I'm allowing him to have his first beer. The kid is stronger and smarter. But when he looked at me for a moment, I saw that same 10-year-old kid. For the first time in a long time, she came up, and I'm thinking it's because of the holiday. He just said, "Dad, do you think she's finally gone?" And I took a long breath before I told him the only two truths that I've ever had. "I don't know, but I love you, buddy." He looked at me and said, "I love you too, Dad." Here's to a safe and happy Easter for everyone out there. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like me to narrate, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you're catching this on YouTube and you like what you heard and saw, why not give the video a thumbs up, share it with a friend, leave a comment. I'd love to know what you thought of the stories. It's all free and it all helps out with the algorithms, so I appreciate it. Follow me on social media, and if you'd like to take your support a step further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description and consider getting some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. A link to my TeePublic storefront is also in the description. Everyone, be excellent to each other, and until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything: a ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.